introduction to the work of Dorothy Roberts occurred shortly after I started graduate school and was assigned my first graduate school paper. The course was Contemporary African American Women's Writing, and the novel I chose to write about was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. The class comprised of 6 white males, 2 white females, and myself, had addressed the novel early in the semester. As a consequence, I spent the remainder of the semester rather annoyed by the consensus that had built among my peers that self-loathing, self-destructiveness was the principal cause of the Breedlove family's downfall in the novel. This was a sentiment that did not sit well with me at all, especially though not only because it seems to suggest by extension that Pecola Breedlove, the little black girl that is the victim of her father's rape in the novel, was in some way responsible for her fate. So I decided to write through the annoyance. I developed an argument that teased out the social values and communal practices in The Bluest Eye that contributed to the Breedlove family's perceptions of themselves as ugly and undesirable, and helped to explain some of their destructive behaviors. In formulating this argument, I discovered Dorothy Roberts. In a 1996 piece titled Biology, Justice, and Women's Fate, Professor Roberts simply cautioned us to rail against social inequalities masquerading as biological fact. There are undeniable biological differences between women and men, she concedes, and these differences may in fact be inevitable. Similarly, the color of one's skin is a function of one's genetics. However, differences between the sexes and the races in many cases matter solely because they have been transformed into social and economic deprivation. Therefore, people interested in social justice should always test claims of biological difference to see whether or not they actually cloak a social norm that has become transparent because of socially imposed gender and racial inequalities. For a conference whose theme is violence, trauma, resilience, and recovery, the Black Women's Health Task Force at Tulane University could think of no scholar and community activist more appropriate to call upon to set the tone for the work we had set about achieving than Professor Dorothy Roberts. The contributions she has made to fostering understanding of the ethical and policy implications of advances in technology and science for Black women and children are vast and varied. Her classic merging of Black feminist and social science theory in Killing the Black Body to interrogate the destructive effects of the war on drugs on communities of color and assault against Black women's autonomous influence over their bodies throughout the Reagan, Bush 1, and Clinton years continues to resonate in a contemporary framework of resurgent neoliberal and neoconservative attacks on women's reproductive rights and the ever-expanding prison industrial complex. Currently, Professor Roberts is jointly appointed in the School of Law and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is the George E. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner-Moselle Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. Please join me in welcoming to the podium our distinguished keynote speaker and longtime champion of the health and well-being of Black women, Professor Dorothy Roberts.
So nice to be here. I have had such a warm welcome to New Orleans. A wonderful evening last night with the Women's Health and Justice Initiative. And thank you, Ngana, for your invitation to come here and all your help in getting me here and your warm welcome and your introduction. I really appreciate it. So you can see, let's see if I can get rid of this. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Or is there a way to dim the lights maybe a little bit? So that you can still see what you're eating though? I kind of modified my title a little bit from the new biopolitics of Black women to the old and new because I realized that, is that okay? This is what I want to talk about has been going on for, okay, now I need a little lighter. I maybe can you turn the lights on over on this side a little bit more? Okay, good. Okay, is that cool now? All right, got it. All right, so what I want to talk about has very old roots, and that's interesting. Dr. Lewis mentioning an article that I wrote so long ago, and how, you know, I'm thinking, boy, what I said way back then is still true today. And in fact, it's so connected. I forgot about that article, to tell you the truth. It's very connected to this history that I'll talk about that originates in slavery and continues decade after decade after decade, but dressed up in new garb, very often new scientific garb, to make it seem as if now it has some credit to it. So let me begin with an article that was published in Chicago Magazine in 2007 about the deadly difference. So the deadly difference is the difference in death rates between Black and white women from breast cancer in Chicago. In the city of Chicago, Black women have a lower incidence of breast cancer than white women, but they're twice as likely to die from it. This means that every year in Chicago, over 100 women, Black women, die from breast cancer who would have been alive if they had the same mortality rate as white women. And so if their conditions were the same as white women's conditions, over 100, every year, over 100 Black women would be alive. That's just for breast cancer. I mean, if we added everything else, it's probably, you know, we could probably get up into the thousands of Black women who would be alive if they had the same conditions that support health that white women have. Now, some people say, well, there's something about Black women, something wrong with Black women that makes them die from breast cancer at such high rates. But what the researchers found, and I don't know if you can see this, this is a chart showing the rates of breast cancer deaths among Black and white women. The top red line is Black women's death rate from breast cancer. The bottom blue line is white women's death rate from breast cancer from 1980 to 2005. So if you look over at 1980, you'll see that Black and white women in Chicago died at the exact same rate from breast cancer. By the time you get to 2005, that you see this huge gap with Black women dying at twice the rate. So the only explanation for that is that something happened to dramatically improve white women's experience of breast cancer that did not happen to Black women. And Steve Whitman, who was pictured on the prior slide, who was the lead physician researcher on the study, explained to me when I talked to him about it, that this means that white women had the benefit of improvements in detection and treatment and living conditions that affect breast cancer, that cut their rate of death in half. And Black women in Chicago did not get one single bit of benefit from that. Not one single bit of benefit. Now, I could go on and tell you about what happens with Black women with breast cancer in Chicago, and how in Englewood, when the mammogram machines are low quality to begin with in Black neighborhoods, but when they break down, they just break down, we wouldn't have to travel far to get one. I could tell you about differences in the living conditions in the neighborhood. I could tell you about differences in the experience of racism. I could tell you about differences in getting good treatment. You know, I could do a whole lecture on that, but that explains why we have this life and death situation in Chicago. It's just this one disease of breast cancer. And, you know, I could go on and tell you about how I could do a similar story with cardiovascular disease, with diabetes, with asthma, with other cancers. In the higher experience of suffering and death that Black women continue to have today, and that, as this chart says, the gaps are getting worse for much of this. So what I want to explore is the past, present, and future of what I'm calling the biopolitics of Black women's health. And biopolitics is the relationship between biology and power. The way in which the power to control life and death is distributed in our society. Or in other words, the political regulation of life. And if I may take some liberty with this year's conference theme, Violence, Trauma, Resilience, Recovery, I want to focus on violence, resistance, and transformation. The violence against Black women that damages our health and is legitimated by dehumanizing biopolitics. The resistance that Black women have always put up against this violence, and the transformative vision of ending violence and promoting health and justice that Black women are championing. And I want to end by pointing the way to a new biopolitics that understands the relationship of race, gender, biology, and power, and values Black women's bodies and lives in a radically different way. So first of all, race is fundamental to biopolitics in America. Race itself is a biopolitical category. It's a system of governing people that classifies human beings into a political hierarchy based on invented biological demarcations. Okay, what we think about as racial division are purely invented. They're not natural in the body. You cannot tell what race someone is unless you ask, what is the rule for defining race in this society at this particular time? It's impossible to tell just from someone's body what race they are. And the fact that we can identify someone's race is just because we're doing it based on some rules that we were taught about how to tell what race somebody is. Now, why was it invented? It was invented in order to organize people around a system of enslavement and conquest and colonialism to determine who got to be the masters, who were thought to be superior, and who were the ones who had to be the slaves, so the conquered people, who were then also deemed to be inferior biologically, in intelligence and beauty, in morals, in every way. So U.S. biopolitics, the state's power to control the life and death of populations, continues to rely on classifying people by race. But Black women in America, since the time of slavery, have expanded racial biopolitics to take into account the interlocking oppressions of race, gender, and class. In recent years, we've theorized and named this way of thinking about oppression intersectionality. And I think it's because we often find ourselves out of place in single-focused analyses or organizations or struggles. And so we're drawn to the intersections, to the relationships of identity, of systems of power, of political movements. This approach was stated most clearly by the Combahee River Collective. The opening statement of their 1970, I'm going to hold it a little bit further away, of their 1977 statement says it all. And I think it's so important, we talk about intersectionality today like it's new, but this idea has been around for a long time. So this is back from 1977, a statement of this group of Black feminists. And they said, we are a collective of Black feminists who have been meeting together since 1974. The most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and caste oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. As Black women, we see Black feminism as the logical political movement to combat the manifold and simultaneous oppression that all women of color face. I just love how bold they were. We think we're the ones, have the right way of thinking. Were we talking about this in the car last night when me and Matthew said, right, being bold? Listen to us. I love it. Okay. So, the statement's description of the genesis of contemporary Black feminism is a good segue to the key relationship I want to explore in my talk, the relationship between the biological and the political. So this is what they said about where Black feminism comes from. And they said, quote, Black women have always embodied, if only in their physical manifestation, an adversary stance to white male rule, and have actively resisted its inroads upon them and their communities in both dramatic and subtle ways. So they're saying that Black women embody a political position. I know, just think about that. We embody a political stance to oppression. Now, though it's often left out of analyses of U.S. biopolitics, Black women's bodies have been absolutely crucial to this relationship of race, biology, and power from its origins in slavery to the present day, in which anti-Black racism and state violence support a neoliberal regime of inequitable economic, social, and governance policies. In particular, laws and policies that punish Black women's sexuality and childbearing are the linchpins of an oppressive biopolitics that spans all of these regimes. In other words, dehumanizing and punishing Black women's bodies is the glue that sticks together all these systems and the way they operate, not only to punish us, but to maintain an unequitable, inhumane regime for everybody. Black women are at the center of that. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit, because I think all of this originates in slavery, and I'm going to bring it forward though. Under the regime of chattel slavery, Black women's bodies served a critical biopolitical function. Black women were commercially valuable to their masters not only for their labor, but also for their ability to produce more slaves. Black women were property, who not only worked for their masters, but gave birth to their masters' property. Whites then could maintain their domination and increase their wealth by devising a legal and political apparatus that gave them control over Black women's sexuality and childbearing. So again, that control over Black women's body was essential to the system of slavery. It couldn't have functioned. It would have died off without that regulation. So therefore, the very first laws in the colonies were about Black women's bodies. relationship were radically altered to support this biopolitical function of black women's bodies. So one of the colony's very first laws, the Virginia statute enacted in 1662, gave children born to slave mothers and fathered by white men the status of the mother of slaves. So they changed their whole system of their status coming from your father in order to support slavery and control black women's bodies, which were key then to the whole status of black people in America. The essence of black women's experience during slavery was the brutal denial of autonomy over reproduction, dictated by their master's stake in their reproductive lives. Also, the sexual violation of enslaved women and girls set a long-lasting foundation for contemporary notions about black female sexuality. One of the most horrific aspects of slavery's ownership of black bodies was enslaved women's experience of sexual exploitation by their masters. The institution of slavery created for slaveholders the possibility of unrestrained sexual access and control. This encompassed both slave masters' sexual aggression at will against their female slaves and their requirement that enslaved girls, and let's not forget this, young girls were forced into early sexual experiences with them, the masters, and with enslaved men. The law didn't recognize any of this as any violation of black women's autonomy, freedoms, rights, bodies. They said black women didn't have any of that. On June 23rd, 1855, a 19-year-old enslaved woman in Missouri named Celia resisted being repeatedly raped by her owner, Robert Newsom, and clubbed him to death when he backed her into a corner. A judge rejected her claim of self-defense, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and hanged on December 21st, 1855. We're all too familiar with the repertoire of ugly images created to legitimize these violations, images that paint black women as engaging in sex and procreating recklessly, then passing down a depraved lifestyle to their offspring. Now, I could spend all day talking about all the stereotypes about black women. I'm just going to focus on a few. Two of the most prominent were images of enslaved women and erotic opposites, the oversexed Jezebel and the asexual Mammy. Jezebel was supposed to be a woman governed by her sexual desires and made white men's sexual abuse of black women seem justified. So if black women were inherently promiscuous, they couldn't be violated. Jezebel also defined black women in contradiction to the prevailing image of the true woman, who was virtuous, pure, and of course, white. Black sexuality is defined as inherently and essentially immoral. In dominant U.S. culture, the black female body represents innate promiscuity. Again, this is a biological concept. It's part of the biological essence that supposedly defines the black race. In contrast to Jezebel, the happily subservient Mammy served to justify the exploitation of house slave slavery to symbolize what was ideal slave behavior. Unlike the exotic and erotic Jezebel, Mammy was considered unattractive by white people's standards. Mammy represented the utmost safety and comfort in womanhood because she was both asexual and enslaved and totally devoted to the master's family. Now fast forward, and I'm skipping, the black matriarch, the sapphire, the angry black woman, the strong black woman, there's all these stereotypes, all that affect our health. Every one of them affects our health. But I'll fast forward to the 1990s when the pregnant crack addict was added to the imagery of depraved black maternity. These women were falsely accused by the media as routinely trading sex for drugs which deprived them supposedly, and this was stated in newspaper articles and so-called scientific journals, that this deprived women of their maternal instinct. Like there was a chemical property in crack, and only operated in black women's bodies, that literally shut off maternal instinct, the part of the brain that's maternal instinct. I could go on and on about that. I mean, think of the biological power, gender, heterosexual, racist stereotypes that all are combined in that idea that in black women smoking crack cuts off something called maternal instinct, which is located somewhere in the brain or the heart or something like that. Okay. So again, a biological property that supposedly only resided in black women's bodies. They were supposed to give birth to the so-called crack baby, who again was black and biologically different from any other baby affected by drugs. They were said to lack any social conscience. So the exposure to crack was supposed to deprive crack babies, only crack babies, of some moral, social feature in their bodies. And they were supposed to be destined to a life of welfare dependency and crime. Over the last several years, an anti-abortion billboard campaign within black neighborhoods in cities like New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and New Orleans painted a similar portrait of irresponsible black motherhood that blames black women's wombs for every crisis in black communities. Here's the message: the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Tell me that is not the same message that comes out of slavery, out of eugenics, out of welfare retrenchment, out of locking black women up for using drugs while pregnant. It's the same message applied to a different issue now, the issue of abortion. These stereotypes of sexual and reproductive irresponsibility combined with population control ideology, that is the ideology that you can solve some social problems from keeping certain populations from having children, all support a biopolitics that blames black women's bodies for the consequences of political inequality. Black women's sexuality and childbearing are seen as a social problem. These myths about black women's sexual and reproductive bodies and irresponsibility then support so-called welfare reform, which is today no entitlement. It's just a system for behavior modification. We're trying to coerce women into low-paying jobs and marriage, which isn't a realistic possibility. And so then women are punished and blamed for being poor, for struggling to take care of their children. That's what welfare is all about today. Foster care. Black women are being disproportionately affected by fostering, their children taken from them at higher rates than other women, except Native American women in this country. I have to say partly because of the view that black women already do not know how to take care of children. So, and this is documented in many studies, it takes less risk to take their children away than the children of, in other families. And law enforcement policies, all that make black women the scapegoat for social crises and punish our sexual and childbearing decisions. In the late 1980s, for example, black mothers' crack use became a primary explanation for high rates of black mortality and child poverty, although both of these disparities long predated the so-called crack epidemic. You know, the fact that black babies die at twice and 3 times the rates of white babies in this country, that's been going on, again, since the time of slavery, way before crack ever hit the United States. The state of Mississippi recently charged 16-year-old Rennie Gibbs with murder when she delivered a stillborn baby, while Mississippi has the highest rate of stillbirths in the country. Identifying Black women's childbearing as the cause of deplorable social conditions diverts attention away from state responsibility for ending these conditions and the need for social change. Now, scientists and doctors have played a critical role in developing and implementing the biological strategy of social regulation. Well-respected members of the mainstream medical establishment, I'm not talking about doctors in white supremacist hate groups, I'm talking about everyday doctors in hospitals, mental institutions, prisons, again from the time of slavery all the way to today, have inflicted atrocious injuries on Black women patients under the guise of helping them, like Marion Sims during the time of slavery, who operated without anesthesia on his female slaves to perfect gynecological surgeries. Doctors sterilized tens of thousands of Black and Latino women without their informed and voluntary consent in the 1960s and 70s on grounds they were protecting these women and the public by keeping them from having unwanted children. The North Carolina Eugenics Board operated for more than 4 decades, sterilizing at least 7,000 people by force, coercion, and deceit between 1929 and 1974. In its final decade, most of its victims were Black women who were receiving public assistance and deemed unworthy of having children. And I'm happy to say, finally, after a long controversy, the state of North Carolina is going to pay reparations to the victims of this policy. In an investigative story published last July, reporter Corey Johnson revealed a program that was sterilizing women in California state prisons without mandated approvals. The doctor in charge of all of this, Dr. James Heinrich, told Johnson that he provided an important service to these women in the state of California. He described the $147,460 spent on sterilizations as minimal. And here are his words. He obviously didn't think there was anything wrong with telling a reporter that this isn't a huge amount of money compared to what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreated more. This is not 1913. This is 2013. That a doctor in charge of this program in California state prisons is willing to say, imagine what he wasn't willing to say, what he's thinking about these women that he didn't tell the reporter. As I document in my latest book, Fatal Invention, there is now a new development in scientific research and biotechnology, reinforcing the racial logic of biopolitics in the genomic age. So in 2000, when Bill Clinton announced the unveiling of the first draft of the Human Genome Project, which sequenced the entire human genome for the first time, he made the point that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. And many people thought that this would now be an end to the reliance on racial classifications in genetic research and an end to the myth that race is a genetically determinable natural distinction among human beings. But shortly after that, we saw reporters like Nicholas Wade saying that no, in fact, the next phase of the Human Genome Project would be just the opposite. It would be to study the genetic differences between human races. So in my book, Fatal Invention, I argue that we're now seeing a new biopolitics of race in which scientists are claiming to find genetic distinctions between races and attributing health inequities, inequities in incarceration, in education, in wealth, all of this to innate genetic differences, meaning inferiorities of black people and superiority of white people. In fact, Nicholas Wade just came out with a book, In Troublesome Inheritance, where he says that the whole explanation of human history and why Europeans dominate is because of the evolution of different distinct genetic races. And he has all sorts of, and this was just published May 2014, and he's a prior journalist, science reporter for the New York Times, one of the leading newspapers in the country. So again, we're not talking about some fringe KKK crazy white supremacist who think this. He's a mainstream journalist.
White supremacist.
Yeah, right, exactly, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Like he says, I'm not racist, but I just am writing a book about the innate inferiority of black people and why that explains why they're poor and poor and less intelligent. But that's not racist. Well, then what's racism? I mean, that's like a definition of racism. Okay, so this now is explaining this new theory that now scientists can really prove these genetic distinctions, is explaining all sorts of disparities. And black women's bodies, again, are a prime site for this research. Consider this effort to explain the enduring black-white gap in premature births and low birth weight, resulting in high infant mortality rates, which I know was a subject of discussion here at the conference yesterday. A team of obstetric researchers examined all births in Missouri between 1989 and 1997 to test the hypothesis, and here, this is a quote, "Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk of extreme preterm birth and its frequency of recurrence." Now, what they mean by that, there's some essence in black people that makes us give birth prematurely, that's independent of other factors, meaning anything outside of our bodies, environment, social experiences, social conditions. It's just the essence of the black race that causes this. I don't even know what that means. Like, I don't know how they got that published. How do you publish a scientific article with this hypothesis? Okay, so then they control for WIC and welfare receipts, and they find that these differences still exist. So then they lead to this conclusion that there's a probable genetic component that may underlie the public health problem presented by the racial disparity in preterm births. And by the way, this got a headline in the New York Times, "Genetics Explains Racial Disparity in Preterm Births." And so, those of you who know how to do scientific research, and I'm sure there are many, well, you don't even have to know how to do it. You can just see how illogical it is to say, oh, well, even the women who receive WIC have, even the white women who receive it and the black women who receive it there's still a gap, so therefore it must be genetic. And I mean, they didn't control for the racism that the black women experience that could cause the stress that leads to preterm births. For one thing, they didn't even consider that. So again, how this got published, I'm not sure. While the racial gap in health widens because of structural inequities and policies like mass incarceration, that's another thing. I mean, can you imagine the toll on people's health of being locked up, even the fear of being locked up that children in many black communities already have? What's the toll on your health? Like, why are you studying, looking for some asthma gene to explain severe asthma in black children? Could it be that every time they hear a police siren, could that not be a reason for higher rates of blood pressure and severe asthma? I think that's more logical. But guess what gets the money? The research funds. Okay, so while gaps in health widen, the poor health of African Americans opens up new markets for pharmaceutical companies. And so now we have the emergence of race-specific medicine, which is supposed to be the answer to racial health disparities in this country. This is a drug called Vital, which is the first race-specific drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 2005. I don't have time to tell you all about it, but just in case you think that there really was developed a drug for heart failure for Black people, let me tell you that this drug was developed by a cardiologist in Minnesota without any regard to race whatsoever. It's simply a combination of two generic drugs that dilate the blood vessels and make it easier for the heart of someone suffering from heart failure to pump blood, and therefore increases the chance of survival. So it just works in the way that, you know, human hearts and human blood vessels operate. You know, and he figured out that if you have blood vessels that pump blood to your heart, if they're dilated, it might help if you're suffering from heart failure. And so he combined it into this pill. He got a patent on it, no mention of race whatsoever. But the FDA wouldn't approve it because he didn't conduct a clinical trial to test the drug. By the time he got to that point now, he needs a new patent because his patent's going to expire. To get a new patent, he needs a new claim. So he added to the old patent the claim that this was for African American patients. He did not change the formula of the drug whatsoever. The FDA told him if he tested on Black people and it works, they would approve it for Black people. So he put together with the Association of Black Cardiologists a clinical trial involving only African Americans. The only difference was there was a control group that didn't get it, the Bio, but got other therapies, and then the group that got Vital on top of other therapies. Yes, the group that got Vital did better. There was a huge drop in death. So it worked. And the FDA stating that they were using race as a proxy for genetic difference, even though there was absolutely no genetic testing connected to the development of the drug whatsoever, or the clinical trial of the drug. They just made up this theory. The FDA, scientists at the FDA just made up this theory, and then they approved it. The label says it's for self-identified African Americans. Okay. Now, some people, you know, I mean, there may be some people here that there were Black people supporting this. I have to say, BWHC supported this. They did have to get a $1.3 million grant from the company that manufactures it. I don't want to offend anybody, I'm just stating the facts. Some people supported it. In my opinion, the labeling it for Black people was totally unscientifically supported, and it sends a message that if something works on Black people, we don't know it'll work on any other human being, because Black people are so distinct from other human beings. I think that is a negative message. At any rate, was not supported by any of the development of this drug. So the claim that race-based drugs will shrink the gap based on genetic difference is a powerful way to deflect concerns about the social inequities that actually drive poor minority health. Why is it that young, and the gap in deaths from heart failure are not older people, it's young, it's that young Black men die from heart failure at far higher rates than young white men. That's what drives this gap. Again, why do you think young Black men are more likely to get heart failure and die from it? Do you really? I mean, think of the stresses that young Black men are under. So why are you going to look for a race-specific drug as opposed to addressing the conditions that are causing this gap? And to me, saying that it's because of some genetic difference that black people's hearts function differently than white people's hearts. That's just a way to ignore the social conditions that are actually causing this gap. Now, while this is going on, all this focus on differences in the body that are supposed to be the cause for inequities in our society, we have a majority of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court saying we shouldn't pay attention to race because racism has ended. You know, they strike down part of the Voting Rights Act. We don't need voting rights laws in the United States anymore because black people are free to vote in America. I mean, that's basically what Scalia said. They think the civil rights movement ended all racism in America. And now any attempt to address racism is reverse discrimination against white people. I mean, they literally say this in their mayor. Clarence Thomas literally said there is a moral equivalent between Jim Crow laws designed to oppress black people and state efforts that take race into account to address that. He said that that's the same. Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts says in a decision striking down efforts to desegregate schools, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. So at the very time that we are being told that race is important at the genetic level, we're also told racism doesn't matter in our society anymore. Now, if you're getting that message and you see that black people are locked up at 7, 8 times the rate of white people in America, you see that black kids drop out of high school and are arrested as children, you know, at many times the rate of white children, that black children die still 2 to 3 times the rate in infancy of white. So then you have to, well, there's no racism in America. What's going on? What's causing this? When you are going to latch onto this argument, it's because of black people's genes. That's why it causes them to be more violent, more criminal, less intelligent, poorer health. And so to me, it's the convergence of these two ideologies of post-racialism and colorblindness and of biological determinism, racist biological determinism, those two together that are especially dangerous, which may, and with scientists now seen as neutral. We don't have to worry about them because they're not like the scientists of the past. They're racially neutral and objective. You know, all of that to me makes us a more dangerous time than we have seen in the past. And the gaps are increasing even more. I need to, what time is it? I just need a time check. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up now. Okay. No, but I want to see if there's time for questions. Oh yeah, I want to sell some books. All right. I'm on my last leg now of this. Okay, so how do we end this toxic biopolitics of black women's bodies that's damaging our health and legitimating violent enforcement of a neoliberal, white supremacist racial order? Black women across the country, and as I saw last night here in New Orleans, are organizing for reproductive and sexual justice and inventing new paradigms that break from tradition. Black feminists have been at the forefront of transforming thinking about reproductive freedom from a framework of choice that offers limited protection against state violence, if any, and only in that case for the most privileged women, and absolutely no claim to government assistance to actually be able to effectuate your reproductive decisions. So we're changing that kind of choice to one of reproductive justice. Our vision comes out of movements against violence and sterilization abuse as much as abortion rights, and out of grassroots organizing as much as professionalized reproductive rights organizations. For example, Sister Song and other reproductive justice organizations launched a campaign called Always Resist, Trust Black Women, to counter the anti-abortion billboards that I showed before. Reproductive justice places reproductive health and decision-making in its social context of racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and economic oppression, and sees the fight for reproductive rights as part of a broader struggle for social justice. Black feminists and other women of color have also understood the inextricable relationship between intimate and institutional oppression and made this relationship central to their resistance strategies. We situate private violence within a broader context of inequitable social structures, including male domination, but also barriers created by poverty, racism, and government policies that trap many women in violent homes. We tie domestic violence to a continuum of social and state violence that, in the words of Angela Davis, extends from the sweatshops through the prisons to shelters and into bedrooms and home. These scholars and activists have cautioned against participating in a criminal justice regime that incarcerates astronomical numbers of Black men and women and children, causing devastating consequences to their families and communities. Black women also are at heightened risk of being victimized themselves by police brutality, including when they seek protection against violence in their homes. At the same time, state and federal governments have refused to allocate similar resources to programs and services that would make women less vulnerable to violence. I mean, they are more willing to allocate money and resources to prisons than to changing the conditions and providing programs and policies that would actually reduce violence against women. In fact, tough on crime post-conviction penalties, such as federal lifetime bans on receiving welfare benefits, post-secondary financial aid, and public housing, the collateral penalties that go along with the conviction, intensify the vulnerability of formerly incarcerated women. Our analysis points to cross-movement strategies that can contest multiple forms of systemic injustice and can develop collective efforts within communities to address private violence, efforts that rely on the strength and accountability of community members rather than on punitive state intervention. So I see Black women as at the forefront of a movement for a new biopolitics of health, one that rejects a racist biological determinism that blames Black women's bodies for health disparities and social problems, and instead understands the damage that systemic injustices inflict on our bodies. We are fighting for a new biopolitics that affirms our common and equal humanity by working to end the unhealthy consequences of the political inequities that are what truly divide us. So let's inspire each other to continue the struggle for justice, which is the only path to a healthier world. Thank you.